Hello and welcome to the Centre for Western Sydney's discussion ahead of the federal budget due to be released on the 14th of May. My name's Dr. Rhonda Itaoui and I'm the Director of the Centre for Western Sydney. And to my right, we have Professor Andy Marks, the Executive Director of the Centre for Western Sydney, and Professor Neil Perry, our newly appointed Chief Economist at the Centre and the School of Business at Western Sydney University. Today marks the beginning of a range and a series of discussions and outputs from the Centre for Western Sydney around the implications of the federal budget and the core issues at the core of our minds of our communities and voters here in Western Sydney. I'm going to start with a question that's really a pressing one in relation to our upcoming local elections, federal elections. What does the upcoming federal budget mean politically, Andy, for the Western Sydney region?
Thanks, Rhonda, and it's great to be part of this discussion. Look, I think that without question, this is an election budget or pre-election budget. They need to go to the polls before May next year at the latest. And like always, Western Sydney is going to feature. I think the critical thing for us to think about too is that the traditional supporter bases for Labor, for example, in Western Sydney are coming under challenge. Southwestern Sydney, the rise of the independents, looms as an issue for Labor, more so than the coalition. Lee taking the seat of Fowler from Labor at the last election, former Liberal, now independent Lee, has really opened up politics in this region as something that is not necessarily wedded to the traditional party alignments. So I think residents and voters, let's face it, they're all voters, will be looking very closely at measures around cost of living. There's a lot of sensitivity around geopolitical issues as well with Gaza. So in southwestern Sydney in particular, they'll be looking to see some firmer positioning from the government on those humanitarian type issues. I think also economically we can think about the great inequity we see in terms of income, in terms of transport, congestion, housing, etc. All of those factors that make living a bit of a challenge. They won't expect the budget to solve all of them, but they will expect the government to focus very squarely on cost of living. And that really will play into that lead up as to the kind of clear air the government can get ahead of the run into the election. But independents will be very opportunistic, so you will see a lot of commentary from non-traditional sources in Western Sydney about the budget.
Absolutely. And speaking of cost of living measures, one of the key headlines that's occupying the news cycle at the moment is around the revised Stage 3 tax cuts.
Yep.
And Neil, I'm hoping you could give us a little more information about what these tax cuts mean, and in particular, how these might play out in different parts of Sydney.
Yeah, sure. So the tax cuts really aren't a cost of living issue. They're very much about what's called bracket creep. So basically in our tax system, it's a progressive tax system. So the higher your income, the higher your average tax rate. But, through time, basically our incomes rise in a nominal sense. And since the last tax cuts, that's been happening a lot, especially with inflation and higher incomes and things like that. So what you've got then is that people are paying higher average tax rates, and that gets up to a level where the government says, well, that's too much in terms of like the total amount of income tax coming into the budget, and so they have to reduce it. So it's really not a cost of living measure. And then, basically you've got different parts of Sydney get different benefits from that. So when we look at the actual tax cuts, you've got very high incomes getting a bigger tax cut than very low incomes. And that's obviously therefore not a cost of living measure. And also you've got specific regions who are high income regions, and they get a much bigger tax cut than areas in parts of Western Sydney like Fairfield, which are a lower income area.
Yeah, I can absolutely see how that would be a critical issue on the minds of our communities.
Yeah.
Just based on our conversations and our engagements with community, we know that the cost of living is being acutely felt in parts of Western Sydney. So I know our Bridging the Divide issues paper uncovered that 57% of Western Sydney residents are earning less than the minimum wage. Yep. That's less than $800 per week. And when we think about the cost of rent as a proportion of that, we know that that is simply not enough for our residents. I'm thinking as well about the rising cost of energy and how urban heat results in our residents paying more for energy, and the ways in which the cost of living is affecting those communities. So combined, with higher mortgage payments, and, our residents having a higher proportion of mortgage-owned homes, combined with lower incomes and higher energy costs, the community on the ground is really feeling the rising cost of living. And I'm sure that is going to be on the mind of our voters and of our communities. So, Andy, really building on that in terms of that financial strain, what would this mean politically in terms of local government elections and federal elections? And I know you've touched on it, but really just fleshing out how those concerns might play out politically.
Yeah, look, it's a good question. And, ahead of the federal elections, of course, we have the local government elections in September in the region. We've already seen a lot of jostling, again, with independents really taking the running on some of those key issues. Every election in Western Sydney in the last 5 to 10 years has been one on local politics. So, it's about those issues that are felt at the neighbourhood level. It's about resilience during lockdown. It's about opportunities for job creation, things like the airport, things like Bradfield. So there's a real consciousness of what's happening in your community, in your neighbourhood. So local government elections will be a really good barometer for what's going to play out federally and at the state level in a few more years' time. I think that issues around access to basic services, funding for health, funding for schools, etc. There's a crossover, of course, in state and federal budget spheres around those issues, but they will feature prominently. Some issues that are also going to play will be what's being done around housing affordability. Again, there's a state and a federal dimension to that, but the Albanese government can't afford to neglect that in places like Western Sydney. To Neil's point as well, ensuring that we start to see some efforts towards wage equity, which means the generation of quality jobs and higher paying jobs in Western Sydney will be critical. A lot of the time in budgets, the focus is on big kit, on large transport infrastructure and large projects that effectively don't do a lot to address job generation within communities. So I reckon if politics is local, and we think it is increasingly in Western Sydney, the federal budget will start to focus on some of those issues. Werriwa and seats like McMahon surrounding Fowler that were lost to an independent, while not quite marginal, they've seen a swing away from Labor at most recent elections. So they'll be conscious of that, the Labor Party, and they'll want to address those things. So local politics will feature heavily in a federal budget.
Absolutely. And I know in our discussions and in our work at the Centre for Western Sydney, we're really interested in exploring what a Western Sydney politics looks like, what is emerging and what is on the mind of voters and the ways in which these dynamics play out. Is there anything else you wanted to
It's a great point. And look, we were tossing around, how we define this, Rhonda and I, earlier on. And I think it's about an unaligned politics. There was a lot of belief that in Western Sydney there's not a high level of political consciousness, that people will just stick with Labor, stick with Liberal, etc. They are incredibly politically engaged. We've seen that by the way that communities have spoken out on particular issues in their community, related, again, as I said, to issues happening internationally, domestically. They are incredibly politically conscious, but they're not necessarily wedded to one party. So the idea that the Western Sydney of old, where you were either rusted on Labor or part of John Howard's battlers, that's gone out the door for large sections of Western Sydney. Fowler is a really good example of the politics of rapid and quick and local engagement. So it's no longer a long stretch of political campaigning. It's really tightly focused local campaigning that'll get you over the line. And that Labor should be aware of that if their intelligence is good.
Absolutely. And some of our place-based analyses really point to those localised issues and the ways in which communities are thinking about or experiencing particular issues or challenges and strengths at the local level. So I think there is real merit in us continuing to take a place-based approach in understanding, addressing those issues, but also thinking politically in how we engage with those communities. And I know our work will continue to touch on that and those dynamics. Neil, my question is really around those big ticket items that Andy alluded to. What are the big initiatives that we can anticipate in the budget and how might they impact communities in Western Sydney?
Well, I guess the biggest one that's come out and received some criticism as well from economists is the Made in Australia policy. I think that's going to have a big impact on Western Sydney. So you've got the potential for, strengthening the manufacturing that's already in Western Sydney with some subsidies, hopefully, from the government to help encourage that kind of local industry to build up and scale up and become bigger and part of global supply chains would be really fantastic. And that's particularly in the areas, future industries, like producing solar panels and batteries and those types of green technologies. So I think that's the major one. There has been some backlash against that. And in my mind, it's not, really justifiable that, it's a good thing that government's come out and supports those industries. Economists will argue that that takes resources away from what they call higher valued uses elsewhere. It certainly takes resources from somewhere. But that assumes, their argument assumes that everything's been purely kind of competitive and everything's currently efficient and there's no distortions in the economy. But there are distortions in the economy. So things aren't necessarily in their higher valued use. And we want to bring them over into these things that we know are going to be really powerful industries in the future and also that people value because we want to produce, in a sovereign sense, batteries, solar panels, semiconductors, all those types of things. We want to produce them locally. So I think that's a really big policy. Really looking forward to seeing the detail on that because we don't know a lot of the detail yet. And then I guess the other one is infrastructure because infrastructure basically, creates connectivity and that creates better kind of what's called effective density. People become closer together. They can communicate more and you get all these agglomeration effects, so learning effects and network effects and labour matching effects. People can find a job better, find their job better. So, yeah, I think the two biggest things for me, apart from the cost of living stuff that's been mentioned, are those two big ticket items like that. Yeah.
I'd like to elaborate a little more on the agglomeration effects that you mentioned. If you don't mind just describing what that looks like and in particular why that's important in Western Sydney.
Yeah, so it's a theoretical term, but basically it means that businesses are effectively coming closer together. And also is your workforce effectively becoming closer together. And that can happen by making a city bigger or it can happen by making a city more dense, so more connected. Basically. And if you can do that, then it's easier for you to find the job that you need. It's easier for you to discuss with other people in your supply chain or in your particular industry and learn from each other. So they're the kind of major effects from it. It's also sharing infrastructure as well. They're also sharing infrastructure. So all these things have benefits. The individual benefits by being in it, but by them being in that agglomeration, that benefits everyone else. And it's that externality, that's occurring. That's the real kind of strength of agglomeration. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I guess there's an element that plays into the way we're rethinking housing too in Western Sydney.
Sure. Increased
density, for example.
Yep.
Yeah.
And we see things like the Northwest Metro, which is in Western Sydney in part. And what the effect of that is that it's created more business density along the line. And, people are able to come in from elsewhere and move into that employment position more easily because they can get there more easily.
That's going to become a question, I think, at the federal budget as well. A lot of agitation from state and local representatives around whether or not the federal government is doing enough to fund connections to infrastructure like the airport, like those precincts, etc. So there'll be a lot of pressure. We've seen it even at the local government level, advocacy towards the federal government, pretty strident about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And transport connectivity is the consistent issue and challenge that comes up every time we speak with our communities across a whole range of issues. It's the key to unlocking the potential of the region. And it's a message that we hear time and time again. I think we have a lot to look forward to and a lot that we will be keeping our eye out for in the upcoming release of the budget. I'd just like to close and say that this marks the beginning of a range of outputs here at the Centre for Western Sydney in analysing the federal budget. We have an issues paper that will be released following the release that will unpack the implications of some of the policy changes and the promises for the Western Sydney region. And we do look forward to coming back together as a group to discuss the implications of the budget that's passed down on the 14th of May for the region and for our communities. Thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to following up following the release.